Welcome to another Donna Downey Studios Artist Gang Tuesday. I'm Andrea Walford from AndreaWalfordDesigns.com. Today I'm going to show you how I created this Be a Voice 12 by 12 mixed media canvas using 5 different Donna Downey Studios stencils. So I'm working here on a 12 by 12 canvas, and my first step was to create a base layer of collage. And for that, I just grabbed a bunch of different ephemera that I had in my stash and started applying it using my golden soft gel mat. Now I included things like old doilies, different types of tissue papers, vintage book text, some labels, as well as some stickers. And I just started applying them randomly to various areas of my canvas. No rhyme or reason to it. I also did include some washi tape that I had in my stash. Now, when you're creating a layer of collage in your artwork, it's always important that you want to make sure it's well sealed above and below. So as you can see, I'm applying my gel medium onto my canvas, placing my piece of ephemera on top, and then using my brush to apply another layer of my gel medium on top. So that way you make sure that your pieces are well embedded onto your canvas. Now, once I had everything placed where I wanted it and I was happy with how my first layer looked, I then used my heat tool to dry the gel medium so that I could move on to my next step. So now at this point, I wanted to start creating a cohesive background for my piece because of course, wherever you add a layer of ephemera, the areas in between where the canvas is still showing, there's going to be a difference in height, even though it's only slight. So I took some of my Liquitex super heavy gesso and using a palette knife, I started applying it into those areas in between the ephemera pieces just to kind of even out my surface. But then I also started applying it randomly all over the canvas just to add a little bit of texture and to just kind of start blending those ephemera pieces into the background. And I didn't want to apply too much because although I did want to add some texture, I still wanted to be able to see what I had below. So once my gesso was dry, I started adding some additional visual texture using my Donna Downey Studios stencils and starting with the Neutral Gray 5 Liquitex Professional Spray Paint. It was a nice light color of paint that gave good texture to the canvas but didn't overwhelm it in the way that black might have. Now the two stencils that I used with that particular color of paint was the Alphabet Rerun and the Halftone Dots. And for both stencils, you may have noticed I sprayed my paint through the stencil and then I flipped my stencil over and used a paper towel to press it down against my canvas. So I had both the positive and negative impressions. Once I'd finished with those two stencils, I then took my Color Outside stencil and used a slightly darker color of gray. This time it was the Neutral Gray 3 Liquitex Professional Spray Paint. And I did the same thing. I sprayed through the stencil as well as pressed the stencil to my canvas. Once the paint from my stencils was dry, I then moved on to my first layer of paint with the intent of kind of muting the background without completely losing it. So I used two different colors of golden fluid acrylics, the Zinc White and the Titan Buff, and I mixed them with some of the golden acrylic glazing liquid. Now I did that for two reasons. One, to thin the paint without losing the color integrity, but also to slow down the drying time. So I wanted to create a nice sheer layer of both those colors on my entire canvas surface. Now, without waiting for that layer to dry, I then grabbed a palette knife and the regular golden gesso, and I began applying the gesso along the perimeter of the canvas and then pulling it inwards using my palette knife. So I was now ready to start adding my first layer of actual color. So I used some of my golden teal, the turquoise phthalo, and permanent violet dark, and they're all fluid acrylics. Now you can see there in my left hand I have it's an empty hair product bottle that I filled with water, and what I was doing was spraying my canvas every time I would apply a little bit of the paint, and that was to just kind of thin the paint to make it a little more sheer and make it easier for me to pull along the canvas. So once that layer of color was dry, I then used a little bit of my golden soft gel mat and applied a strip of washi tape. And then I grabbed some more of the golden turquoise phthalo and using my finger, a baby wipe, and occasionally a paintbrush, I started applying some paint on top of that washi tape and then using my finger to pull it downwards. So now here I decided to bring back my Alphabet Rerun stencil, and I used a cosmetic sponge to apply some of that turquoise phthalo paint through the stencil onto my canvas. So for my focal point image, I decided to use the Donna Downey Studios Birds Silhouette stencil. Now instead of modeling paste, I grabbed some golden carbon black heavy-bodied paint and used my palette knife and applied it through the stencil the same way that I would modeling paste. Now, the reason I chose the heavy-bodied paint was, one, it had more texture than the fluid acrylic, so I knew I could build a little bit of height, but I also wanted it to dry to a nice black glossy finish. Had I chosen modeling paste and then mixed it with some paint, the color would not have been as intense black, and it also wouldn't have dried to the glossy finish. So you can see there I applied the larger of the stencils and then used a baby wipe to clean up around the edges. Once I had finished with the larger of the birds, I then used the smaller bird and applied it onto my canvas in the same way. Now, in order to make sure that I kept my lines as clean as possible, I was applying my paint from the outside of my stencil working inward. So I was trying to avoid accidentally pushing the paint underneath the edges of the stencil. And then once I had finished applying my layer of paint, I once again cleaned up the edges using a baby wipe. So now at this point in my canvas, even though the birds were still very wet, I decided that my canvas needed something more, and I didn't have the patience to sit and wait for the birds to dry. So I very carefully held my grunge halftone dots stencil so that any place where the stencil overlapped the birds, it wouldn't accidentally touch down and wreck the paint. And then I used a cosmetic sponge to apply some of that permanent violet dark paint through my stencil in select areas of the canvas. Now, if you're wondering why I didn't speed up the drying process of the birds with my heat tool, it's because when you're working with acrylic paint that's placed that thickly, like it's probably about a 1/16 of an inch thick, if you apply heat to that and you're not careful, you can accidentally end up bubbling the paint and then you completely ruin the effect. So you really do need to let paint like that air dry, and it probably takes a good 3 to 4 hours, if not overnight, to be dry. Now, the quote I used for my canvas is an Albert Einstein quote, "Be a voice, not an echo." I typed it out in a Word document. I used the American typewriter font, which I believe is a free font you can find if you Google it online. I then printed it off using a laser printer. So with a laser printer, I knew that when I applied my medium, it wouldn't cause the ink of the printer to run. I then cut my sentiment apart, and then using my tweezers and a brush with my soft gel mat, I applied it to my canvas. Now, so that my quote wouldn't look quite so stark on my canvas, I thinned down a little bit of my teal fluid acrylic paint with water and then used my fingers to brush a layer of that over top of those little quote pieces. Then, to give it a little bit of depth, I grabbed my Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pen, the cobalt green, and I just outlined around it and then kind of blended it out a little bit with my finger. Now, my final step for this piece was to take some more of my turquoise phthalo paint, and I used a paintbrush, a baby wipe, and my fingers to start spreading it all across the top edge of the washi tape, and then I ended up going all the way across horizontally to the left edge of the canvas and pulling it downwards in the same way that I had done on the right side. And that's how I created my canvas. Well, I hope you enjoyed this week's Artist Gang Tuesday video tutorial, and I look forward to creating with you again.